Hello and welcome to the third and final installment of Fenimore Art Museum's program, The Fight for Recognition, a series of discussions associated with the exhibition As They Saw It, Women Artists Then and Now, currently on view at the Fenimore in lovely Cooperstown, New York. This evening, we feature three experts in the field of art and art history. My name is Danielle Henrici. I am the Director of Education for Fenimore Art Museum and the Farmers Museum, and I am delighted to be your moderator for this evening's program. As They Saw It, Women Artists Then and Now honors the remarkable vision, creativity, and achievements of American women artists working across 3 centuries. The exhibition emphasizes varied experiences and approaches to art making while pushing back against the underrepresentation of women in the arts. The over 60 works on view showcase how women, despite social, economic, and cultural barriers, express their identities and shape her stories through artistic expression. Drawn from the collections of 3 partner museums, the Springfield Museums, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and Fenimore Art Museum, As They Saw It is one in a series of American art exhibitions organized through a multi-year, multi-institutional partnership led by the Museum of Fine Arts Boston as part of the Art Bridges initiative. Many thanks to the Art Bridges Foundation for its support of the educational programs associated with As They Saw It, including tonight's discussion. And now that you know a bit more about the exhibition, I would like to introduce you to our guests. Kiara Hill, Ph.D., is a visiting assistant professor who teaches courses in art history and the Art and Social Practice MFA program in the Schnitzer School of Art and Design at Portland State University. Hill is also a curator of African American art and visual culture. Emily Ann Francisco is an art historian and emerging curator based in the Washington, D.C. metro area. She is currently a Ph.D. candidate in art history at the University of Delaware, where her research focuses on the ways that gardens, nature, and issues of gender shaped the careers of American women sculptors from 1876 to 1950. Emily is also Curatorial Associate for the collection in the Department of Modern and Contemporary Art at the National Gallery of Art, where she works primarily on permanent collection projects and installations. Jessica Shearer is a senior editor at Boston Art Review, as well as an art writer whose work has appeared in Hyperallergic and Photograph magazine, among others. She is interested in narratives of gender, community, and ritual. Kiara, Emily, and Jessica, thank you so much for being here. A quick note for those tuning in live, the discussion will run about an hour and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Please post your questions in the chat and feel free to do so as you think of them. I will scroll through and get to as many as I can. And now, without further ado, let's get started. I think a great place to begin would be if each of you took a few moments to introduce yourselves. Emily, would you like to start?
Sure, happy to. Thank you so much, Danielle, for your wonderful introductions and for inviting all of us here for this conversation. Again, my name is Emily Ann Francisco. I'm based in the Washington, D.C. area. I currently work at the National Gallery of Art as Curatorial Associate for the collection in Modern and Contemporary Art. And I'm also working on my Ph.D. I'm a candidate in art history at the University of Delaware. And so I start with all that because I'm coming into this conversation with these 2 backgrounds, really. I work for a large museum, obviously, and My job is primarily focused on the permanent collection. So what that means, I support our modern and contemporary art curators on all of the logistics and really labor that goes into adding artwork to the collection. I also work on collection shows, and I work on a range of other different kinds of collaborative projects across the museum. And thinking just in terms of my work related to women artists and museums, I've done a lot of data-driven research about the history of living women artists in the National Gallery's collection. So just thinking about, when the National Gallery has acquired a work by a woman artist, how often was it that that artist was still alive at the time that her work entered the collection? And I'm happy to share more about that later on in the conversation, if it's of interest. I also recently co-curated a very small installation called Borderlands, Expanded Views of the Southwest, which is a single room show that focuses on artists who lived in or were inspired by the region we call the Southwest region of North America. And it's sort of a small project that focuses on the early to mid 20th century. It's in our American Places galleries. And my co-curators and I intentionally centered art made by women, Indigenous artists, and Mexican artists in that project. So if you're in the DC area at all between now and the end of November, it's up through then. But anyway, I mentioned I've really these two backgrounds that I'm bringing into this conversation. Aside from my work in museums, I'm an art historian, and I specialize in the history of women sculptors in North America specifically. I'm what many call an Americanist, quote unquote. And I researched mainly the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And I actually first learned about the As They Saw It exhibition while I was visiting the Springfield Art Museum for research a couple years ago. And I was chatting with Maggie North, one of the curators for the exhibition. She had graciously accepted my request to see some sculptures in storage by two artists, Marion Sanford and Cornelia Chapin, who were both women sculptors in the mid 20th century, and they were likely a couple actually. And that Marion Sanford sculpture actually ended up in the Springfield Art Museum presentation of As They Saw It, which made me so happy. Now, Danielle mentioned, I work on gardens and ideas about femininity and sculpture. That's sort of the dissertation land I'm living in right now. I think a lot about, rhetoric and, language in the press and in art criticism, but, from a historical lens, thinking mostly like around the turn of the century, and how, this all has an impact really on the art that women are producing and how they're creating these personas throughout their careers. So anyway, as you can tell, I keep very busy, but across these different hats that I wear as a museum professional and as an art historian, I'm always interested in questions about public space, audience and access, and how things like gender, race, and class all shape the production of artwork across time. So I'm really excited to be here, and I'll pass it off to the next.
Okay, great. Jessica, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hi. Congratulations on your show, Emily. That sounds incredible. Thank you, Danielle and the Fenmore team. And hi, everyone out there in Zoom land. My name is Jessica Shearer. I am an art writer and critic. Just thinking about this earlier today, I think I have, with the exception of one, I think, exclusively written about women artists. And that wasn't intentional, but it clearly says something about my interests. In addition to my own writing practice, I'm a senior editor at Boston Art Review, which is a woman-founded and primarily woman-led team. And we are very careful about making sure that we are writing about women and also other types of underrepresented communities when we're deciding what shows and artists to cover. But we're also thinking about it when we're thinking about who we're asking to write. So this is something I'll probably be talking about a lot tonight. That art writing is and art discourse is a really important aspect of how artists are remembered and the importance that's placed on them over time. So we're really considerate about not only making sure that we're highlighting the work of women creatives, but we're also commissioning the work of women creatives and creatives from other unrepresented groups. Including our emerging art writing fellowship, which is a fellowship, it's the only one of its kind, that invites young people from 18 to 21 to partner with both us and a gallery in the area to learn how to approach art writing and also get their first bylines. And we're on only our second cohort, but so far that fellowship has been comprised of mostly women or non-binary writers and many writers from underrepresented communities. So that is a point I will be continually returning to. I'm really excited about this conversation.
Okay, thank you. And Kiara.
Thank you, Danielle, and the rest of the Fenimore crew, and also having to follow Emily and Jessica. But my name is Dr. Kiara Hill. I am an art historian whose research focuses on the Black arts movement of the 1960s and 70s. I'm also a curator of African American art and visual culture, and an emerging archivist, actually. Part of the work that I had to undertake in writing my dissertation, especially when you're talking about a grassroots cultural movement that was oriented primarily towards the community, is what does it mean to preserve a movement like that? A movement that did not rely on institutional support, a movement that looked vastly different and similar in various locales. And in doing my research, I found that a lot of the information I needed was found in people's basements and really crazy places. But I think that what that did was kind of give me a sensibility around, okay, so what does it mean if an entire generation of artists' like papers and artworks and stories are lost? Like, how will that impact how we understand art history, and particularly the contributions of African Americans toward the late 20th century? And so that has been coming, or increasingly becoming, a part of what I do. My focus is really looking at African American women artists who are not only practicing artists, but also community practitioners. And so I'm very excited to kind of get into that throughout our conversation. I think that for anyone who knows me well, my questions are always, okay, so where are the Black women? Because I know that they're around somewhere. And so whether it's, you know, through curation, whether it's through academic writing, whether it's through writing for museums, a lot of the work that I do centers African American artists, but specifically I try to tease out the nuances and experiences of African American women artists. So I could not be more excited to be part of this conversation. Also, shout out to Maggie North and Springfield Museums, because that's also how I got introduced into this conversation. So just big shout out there.
Awesome. Okay, thank you, Kiara. And maybe let's keep talking about that because Kiara, one of your key research interests is in the Black arts movement of the 1960s and 1970s. So could you provide more context on what happened during this time period and also speak about Faith Ringgold, whose work is featured in our exhibition?
Absolutely. I've actually been thinking about recognition and how that idea is kind of integral and to the work of the artists that I look at, but that period in general. I think about recognition in the form of resistance in terms of, well, let me take a step back, to a couple steps back. The Black arts movement, for those who are unaware of the 1960s and 70s, was this dynamic arts movement that rose in tandem with the Black Power movement. And whereas you have, Black political leaders who are urging for Black power, you have Black artists who are essentially visually translating and textually translating those messages of Black power through various forms of art. And within that, um, there was a push for what was called the Black aesthetic. And even though the Black aesthetic isn't like one agreed upon way of approaching art, um, it is encompassed by essentially accessibility, the idea that Black people should not have to go to museums to be able to encounter Black art. It was about Black people being able to see Black art and knowing it's for them. And essentially, it's about revolutionary art, which, if you're thinking about this particular period of just social unrest, not that much unlike where we are now, you had a lot going on, you had the women's liberation movement, you had, anti-Vietnam War protests, you had the rise of Black power. And I think within all of that, right, and the project of Black liberation that emerges at that point, you also have this kind of fight for recognition on behalf of African American women within this movement. I would like to say that, like, in as much as the Black Power movement was very much so concerned with Black liberation in a variety of iterations, oftentimes Black women's articulation of that was either suppressed or, kind of tossed to the side a bit. And so what happens is that you have Black women artists who are at the intersection of both the feminist arts movement, which, was primarily made up of white women artists, and the Black arts movement, and having to deal with the kind of patriarchal overtones of the Black arts movement at times, and the kind of racism of the feminist arts movement at times. And so what then happens is, for a lot of these women, their politics are informed by both these movements. You have Black women artists who identified as Black nationalists and consider themselves not feminists, not because they actually weren't, but because the term feminist was associated with a particularly white brand of feminism. Even if they themselves, in talking about it years later, what they were doing was essentially performance of Black feminism. And so Faith Ringgold is very instrumental at this time, because she is someone who considers herself, both pro-Black, or considered herself both pro-Black and pro-woman. And so for her, that looked like being very active on the ground in protest. It looked like, collaborating with other women artists and critics like Lucy Lepard to found the ad hoc Women's Art Committee, that protested the Whitney during the 70s because no women and also no people of color were included. She was instrumental in creating Women Artists in Revolution, that group, Women Students and Artists for Black Arts Liberation, and the National Black Feminist Organization. So that kind of gives you an idea of just like where her politics were. And not only that, to me, one of the most exciting endeavors that she had a hand in during the early 70s was, the spearheading of the collective Where We At, which is considered the first group of Black professional artists in New York. And essentially for Where We At, these were women who got together on the basis of feeling like, in so many words, just isolated. Dinka McCannon talks about how, she would ask Black men, Black artists, other Black male artists, like, hey, do you know of any women artists? And they'd say no. And they'd be looking at her and telling her that in her face as a woman artist, She talks about like even just concerns around like, Black women's lived experiences. If you are a mother, what does that mean? How do you create community? How do you find time to do work? How do you find time to garner resources? What about even emotional support? let alone, you know, a space to be able to like critique their work, um, and create work that had their lived experiences in mind. And so Faith Ringgold, I would say, was an extremely important figure in kind of like pushing this agenda of Black feminism that really kind of takes shape in the 80s. But in terms of being someone who was on the ground, making sure that there were spaces for Black women to be heard, not just Black women, but women artists in general, she was extremely instrumental in that. And I'm so glad that like this exhibition included her story quotes, because that is how I first learned about Faith Ringgold. Um, and I think this one is particularly interesting, because it comes from, you know, what she calls her Women on a Bridge series quilts. And the first quote in that series is called Tar Beach, which, you know, I actually read that story growing up. She talks about how like she was looking to try to publish her autobiography and no one would kind of take her on. And so she began creating these stories, literally writing the stories in these quilts. And the first quote being Tar Beach, which essentially is based on this protagonist, was a young Black girl in Harlem named Casey Lightfoot. And it's a story about not only self-expression, but freedom, you know? And within this series, all of the women that she is portraying are free, you know, they're flying, they're free. She talks about the George Washington Bridge being very much so this kind of masculine icon. And so to be able to have these women who are dancing on this bridge, um, and a demonstration of their liberation through this, I think is very interesting. And just to kind of like also throw something else in, this motif of flying is not something that's new. It's actually, you know, an oral history that's been a part of the African diaspora for a long time. It's called The Story of the Flying Africans. And as the story goes, during the transatlantic slave trade, um, as Africans were being enslaved, the myth of the flying Africans is predicated on this idea that they transported themselves back to Africa on their way to the Americas. So, you know, in the work of Faith Ringgold, but in a lot of African American artists, I think this idea of flying takes on this connotation of freedom and liberation. And in this instance, excuse me. And in this instance, in this particular piece, you know, these women are liberated. And I think especially right now, given the recent death of Sonia Massey, given the fact that Kamala is running for president, it's a very weird sensation um, to kind of navigate space as a Black woman right now. You know, on one end, you have this potential beacon of hope, but on this other end, you're grounded in this reality that, like, unfortunately, in a racialized, gendered society, you know, Black women are still being persecuted, still vulnerable to state-sanctioned violence, you know? And so, again, kind of thinking about this idea of liberation and flying, and what does it feel like to not be encumbered by racism, by sexism, by classism, by homophobia, by all of these isms that oftentimes are ascribed to our bodies, I think, to be honest, is an amazing intellectual exercise in and of itself. What does it mean to be free? And as a Black woman, what does freedom mean to me? And I think Faith Ringgold often reverberates that question throughout her practice.
Wow, yeah, there are so many powerful ideas there. Thank you so much, Kiara. I'll turn now to Jessica. I have a question specifically for you as well. So at the Boston Art Review, where you are a writer and editor, there's a focus on contemporary art and culture. You've written articles about exhibitions at major New England museums like the Portland Museum of Art in Maine, as well as many small contemporary art galleries in Boston and beyond. So my question is, have you noticed any difference in a broad sense in the way galleries explore diversity in the artists they choose to show versus a major art museum?
Thank you for that question. Yes. But first, Kiara, thank you for that. That was incredible. And I think, yeah, I'm really interested to hear, Emily, your thoughts. I'm going to kind of touch in your area a little bit here. So, galleries and museums are very different animals. A gallery, and that's good, that they both offer things and they both, you know, can't offer things. But a gallery is much more nimble than a museum. A gallery can be more responsive to a moment because they don't have the privilege and maybe the baggage that comes with boards and trustees and lots of people, lots of money, and lots of opinions. And those things sometimes can make it hard to just turn around and put up a show about something. They also have direct relationships with the artists. So they can be like, hey, you know, it's much easier to get work to put on the walls. So yeah, I would say galleries are probably, I mean, they're nowhere near equity, but they're probably showing women and people of color and other underrepresented communities probably at higher levels. That's been my anecdotal experience. But a gallery is less likely. So a gallery, you're not going to see wall text, really. You're not going to see a catalog, likely. You might not even see object labels. And that's good and bad, right? So that allows the work to be the work and not be encumbered by or overshadowed rather by identity, right? The work can just be the work, and people can respond to it as the work. It's also less likely to get reviewed, you know, so it's less likely to have a life beyond the show itself. Of course, at Boston Art Review, we review our galleries. A museum is going to have all of that stuff, which is a museum show is going to have all of that stuff, which is awesome as well, right? So it's great to have a context. It's great to have a point of view. It's great to have the materials like in the gift shop when you're done. So when you're excited and you want to learn more, you can. I think exhibitions, so the shows at museums right now, are much more likely to show women and people of color. I think you can probably go into any major museum right now and see a great show with work by women and people of color, for sure. The problem is they're not making it into the collections. They're showing the work, but they're not collecting the work. So broadly speaking. So, you know, as of a few years ago, when the last kind of major study of this was conducted, the American museums were 87% male, 85% white. And that's a problem because that's how legacies are built, right? When scholars have access to the work, when writers and the general public, you know, it's awesome for an artist to have a moment and really like have a lot of buzz and have a great gallery show and everything gets bought and then it all lives in people's houses and no one ever sees it again. And then, you know, 20 years later, nobody remembers who that artist is in a lot of cases. So I would say we're definitely better. There's definitely a moment, you know, we're definitely in a moment, but I don't, you know, it hasn't yet been sustained into anything like a movement. And Emily, I'm not to just, but I would be curious since you're more involved in actually collecting, if you find that to be true.
Sure. Happy to take you up on that. I think this is a great conversation already, and it's so tough to follow both you and Kiara, who have had such wonderful remarks. But yeah, Jessica, as you were talking, I was just sort of thinking about this tension that we see playing out a lot, especially these last few years, between collecting and display. So if you had asked me a couple of years ago, I would have made a lot of similar comments, I think, like kind of feeling this frustration and seeing, the numbers, right? Like there have been so many statistical studies and data-driven essays that have come out both like in terms of art criticism and also in terms of scholarship. There's a lot of art historians, for example, right now who are playing with quantitative methods, excuse me, and trying to shed a light on many of these issues, across many time periods, especially in contemporary, but like also looking back, further into like 19th century as well. And from the inside, working at my institution, there's a lot of interest in internal data and tracking. And so seeing the numbers play out internally, there is some progress being made. But part of me wonders, because this is, it is a lot of work, and just the amount of the sheer, you said it yourself a couple of years ago, the numbers were like 90% white male artists in the majority of US art museums. That's really hard to undo, right? Like without bringing in like huge collections, of, hundreds of works by women or Black artists or Native artists, and so on. Like something radical kind of has to happen to shift that needle to like full like parity. And I've just kind of been thinking lately, in 2024 about like what is a realistic goal and what is sustainable, and also like what does representation mean in museums? Is it collecting? Is it the exhibitions and displays? Is it what's seen on the wall, like what's visible? Because I think that's really important too. But as you said, like when a museum acquires a work of art, you're essentially investing in that artist, especially when they're a living artist, right? So what a museum chooses to purchase, but also, let's talk about gifts. A lot of museums, the majority of their collections are, gifts from private collectors, and a museum is accepting that gift. So that's a very active process in a way too. It's just sort of a slightly different dynamic. What, we're acquiring, says something about who, the institution values. So I think it's very intricate, and there's so many moving parts, and I'm still not sure I know, like, I can't fully picture like what a truly like, what's the words I'm looking for?
Equitable?
What a truly equitable, or even just like representational, because we're talking about representation here, right? Like women artists and their work. But what does that look like? I'm not quite sure. And I think depending on who you ask, you might get a different answer. So
yeah. And the point about gifts is also a really, really good point. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Sort of piggybacking off of that conversation, Emily, a question for you. So what is the role of data in promoting change, particularly gender representation in the art world?
Yeah, no, happy to elaborate on that. So like I said, we're seeing a lot of interest in data. In many sectors in general right now, but it's hitting the humanities especially, and in the art world specifically. Honestly, data has always been a part of how museums function. Most museums, especially larger ones, have collections, databases, and software where we document and track our artwork. So with these databases come incredible repositories of data. And so there are a lot of scholars and art critics who are super interested in tapping these unique sources of information to shed light on many of these issues. And there's one very recent study, the Burns-Halpern report. I can't remember if that's the one that you were thinking of, Jessica, but the update, I think, came out just a couple of years ago, maybe 2022. So for those here who aren't familiar with it, Google it if you haven't. It's the Burns-Halperin, Halperin, and it's on ArtNet, I believe, a lot of the findings. And it basically charted different trends across art museums and evaluated, what progress had been made in museum purchases of art by women, and also in the number of exhibitions of work by women artists. And they also did some close analysis through multiple different layers of demographics. They were focused on gender, but they were also honing in on race in particular as well. And I don't have the numbers in front of me right now, but from what I remember, the results were a bit sobering. So while the conclusion was that while there was some progress observed, there was clearly still a lot of work to do. And so I think in general, data like this can be an important wake-up call and a useful tool for institutions. I'm sure many places, in 2022, especially after a surge of new initiatives that came out of the 2020 moment, many institutions probably felt like, oh, we've been changing so much, we've been putting in all this work, and we still haven't, upped our numbers. Like, what do you mean? So it just, there is something very stark about, seeing that quantitative information on paper, and realizing just how critical these issues are, and how many layers there are. But so a different aspect of this conversation too, though, is, from my personal experience, data, and especially collections data, for thinking about acquisitions and objects that a museum is actively, adding to its care. The information can also be used to shed light on hidden stories within a museum's collection. So for me, I referenced earlier, I did this project related to living women artists in the National Gallery collection. And so what that was, a couple of years ago, I was on a team that was working on an exhibition about women artists in the National Gallery. And sadly, that exhibition didn't happen, largely because of COVID. But, the research still survives and is used in different ways. But we were in this meeting for this hopeful show, and we were organizing our potential artworks by the year that they came to the museum. And I noticed this one that came to the museum in 1951, and it was by a printmaker and artist, Mina Citron. And she would have been alive at that point in time when it came to the National Gallery. This may not seem like an important detail, but at the National Gallery, we actually have this story about a major patron named Chester Dale, who bequeathed his collection to us around 1962. And that's kind of the year that we cite as the year that we started collecting modern art and works by artists who were alive. And it was because, Dale had some Picassos, and Picasso was still alive at the time. And, we wanted to take the Picassos, even though up until then, National Gallery, like some other places, comparable institutions, said they wouldn't collect work by an artist unless they had been dead for at least 20 years. It's like this 20-year dead rule. It's kind of funny, but like also kind of cringe. But anyway, so that's 1962. But then how did this work by this amazing female printmaker, come in earlier? So then I started to, dig into it more. I did a lot of analysis using tools available to me in our database system. We use the museum system, or TMS, which is a database that a lot of larger museums use. And it turns out this 1962 landmark year, while it's a big part of the story that we tell, it's not totally correct. And what I found is that there were tons of works by artists who were alive at the time and specifically women, that came into the National Gallery's collection as early as like 1943, which was only like 2 years after we opened to the public. The catch, though, is that all of these, works that were coming up in my searches, and as I was compiling lists and trying to create this data set, they were prints and drawings, right? They weren't paintings, they weren't sculpture. And in the early decades of my institution's history, there was a different culture surrounding prints and drawings. They were part of the collection, but like not really taken as seriously. They weren't, some were shown, but even the way that they were defined, like within our bylaws, was kind of separate from paintings and sculpture. And so anyway, just there's a lot to unpack there in terms of like media hierarchies, even anyway. But so just if you're curious, at least when I had run these numbers a few years ago, and things haven't, I need to sort of update my my charts and spreadsheets to reflect 2024. But at least as of a couple of years ago, about let's see, I had a third of the NGA, the National Gallery's collection, was by artists who were alive at the time that their work was acquired. So that's kind of higher than you might expect of a place that kind of modeled itself on like the National Gallery in London and being an old master picture gallery. And then within that number of, artworks by artists who were alive when the work was acquired, about like a fifth of them, so like 20%, were women. And that's almost double the overall statistic of women represented in the NGA collection, which is more like around 10%, I think. So that's interesting. And I kept, number crunching some more. And if you take, the chunk of the National Gallery's collection that was created by women artists, right? 77% of those artworks were made when the artists were 77 were a lot. Yeah, those artworks were 77% of our works by women artists were acquired by our museum while those artists were still alive. So what that tells me, and what that sort of demonstrates, is that the history of modern and contemporary art and the history of women artists in the collection at the National Gallery, they're like this. They're very intertwined. So anyway, I digress. It's a long-winded story, but it's a reminder that data can help shed light on stories that museums might not realize are already in their collections. They just need to be drawn out.
Yeah.
Or I think in instances, publicize things or make things more legible for the public. I think about the Guerrilla Girls, for example, and how they use statistics as a form of resistance and as a way to like bring attention to these deficits. And I also think about how, and maybe we can probably get into this a little bit later on, just how numbers not just apply to the artworks and the collections, but like also what's factored in is like who's at the table in terms of diversity and who's making decisions and things of that nature. And so, yeah, I think that, thank you for sharing, Emily, because I had an idea, but you definitely laid it all out there for us, for sure. But I think about too, like I said, just how artists, women artists, Black artists have used statistics against museums and institutions to kind of say, okay, well, listen, you're saying one thing, but like, are you really going to be about it? And if not, I'm going to make sure you're exposed, And I think that what that also demonstrated too, in terms of just numbers, when you think about 2020, and I have a couple of theories. I think that unfortunately, yeah, like even when I think about historically, like when I think about the race riots of the late 60s and how during the 70s, there is now all of this public art funding that is available, some of which, Black artists were able to take advantage of, but really a lot of that funding at times was about quelling social unrest, and I think about that now, I think about Black Lives Matter and 2020 being a year of clarity on so many different levels. And I think about how institutions like the Mellon Foundation were like, essentially like, listen, if you all don't have so many, diversity represented in such a way that like, we're going to start pulling funding from you, and that really having to make museums shift. But also like, are you ready to respond to that shift fully, It's crazy that in 2024, we're still talking about, first Black woman curator here, first, you know what I mean? And it's like, okay, so you did it, but like, has the culture of the museum itself shifted and changed to be able to like really be inclusive and tap into the gifts of someone, without just using them as some kind of symbolic gesture or not really giving them the resources they need to succeed? Yeah, go ahead, Jessica.
I'm like, that just makes me crazy, right? I mean, we operate as if women artists haven't always been visible, and they have. They have not only always been making art, they have always been visibly making art. So researchers think that the majority of the cave paintings were done by women, but beyond that, right? We have Artemisia Gentileschi was known when she was painting. Lavinia Fontana was known. Sophonisba Anguissola was so well known that Van Dyck made a pilgrimage to get painting advice from her. Edmonia Lewis was internationally acclaimed. These people have always been visible. And this idea that we just allow ourselves to believe that like, oh, well, women artists weren't really allowed to do anything until, so sure, there are obviously like singular stories among all of these stories of people that couldn't make it happen. And these people are all, not all, many of them have wealth. Many of them have access that other, artists didn't have. But Pliny the Elder in 77 CE named 4 women artists from antiquity. It's not that unknowable, right? Just look at Judy Chicago's dinner party and like go around, and they've always been there, and people have always known they've been there, right? So I think there is, to what, to come back to your point, Kiara, I'm just sort of exhausted with the performed ignorance of like, oh my goodness, how exotic, a woman doing, it's like, no, this isn't that exotic, right? I found this quote. Can I read a quote? Because it cracked me up. It was a review in 1941 of Louise Nevelson. There's a Louise Nevelson in this show. It is gorgeous. Louise is everything. You actually have a lot of Louises in this show. I was looking, and that's awesome. And Louise had just, shown one of her big, beautiful Black found object sculptures. And the critic wrote, "We learned that the artist is a woman in time to check our enthusiasm. Had it been otherwise, we might have hailed these sculptural expressions as by surely a great figure among moderns." It's like, I mean, it's just so intentional, right? And I think that is where we just have to look that in the face and say, it's not that the stories don't exist. It's not that the people haven't been hailed in their time. It's that we're intentionally not paying attention, and we're making intentional decisions not to give people the acknowledgement and the claim and the funding and the seat at the table and all of the other things that you mentioned. Obviously, this show at the Fenimore is very much an intentional acknowledgement of all of that, but it needs to be consistent,
Yeah, and as we're talking, something I was thinking about before today was also this sort of like longer story of, women artists, and how, like, you're right, Jessica, like there have always been women artists. It's just like, how are we, like, who are we lifting up and how are we telling that story? I feel like it's important to acknowledge that question of what defines art, right? Like, because there are so many different types of art make and things that we would, I mean, in 2024, consider art making. Like I would say there has been a lot of progress there. You know, we now see, you know, quilts, textiles, a lot of you know, craft materials, you know, being elevated as, you know, quote unquote fine art in museums and being collected, and that's all wonderful. But you know, why does that matter, right? Like, why does it matter to, you know, hang a quilt from Gee's Bend on a wall in a museum? And why does that act do something, right? Just something to reflect on. And also just if you go back even further, you know, like 18th, 19th century, like, you know, United States specifically, like there's, so I think about, something I'm working on right now in my dissertation research is there's this amazing like horticultural like botanic garden display at the Philadelphia Centennial, and I'm researching this fountain, this marble fountain that was in it, made by a woman artist named Margaret Foley, who was kind of in the Harriet Hosmer and Monia Lewis circle in Rome. But I found out that there were all of these amazing like wax fruits that were displayed as part of the exhibits around, like throughout this horticulture building. And I was talking with my advisor, and she was like, Emily, those are sculptures too. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. These are, and many of them were, I should bury the lead there. Many of these wax fruits and like wax objects were made by women. And so I'm digging into that a little bit more because I'm so intrigued by this now. But to my understanding, this is also like this genre that, you know, was deployed by, you know, women of many different backgrounds, but they're not being called art, you know.
I do want to plug for the Fenimore, and then I swear, Danielle, I'll let you talk. But a plug for the Fenimore. So I saw the show at the Fenimore, and there, to your point, Emily, there's so much beautiful, we would traditionally call craft, historically called craft, fine art by Indigenous peoples in the show, but also there is, and Danielle, not to put you on the spot, but I don't know the name of the gallery, but the name of the gallery that you all have where you showcase a lot of Indigenous work, the gallery is stunning, and the work is hung and presented in such a thoughtful and respectful way. And not to say that everything, I don't know the relationship between the federal, and obviously Indigenous art, it's always complicated, but it is really, really wonderful, and I encourage everybody to go see that while they're there to see the other show.
Thank you, Jessica. Yeah, the Fall collection is extraordinary, and we are so proud to have it at the Fenimore Art Museum. And actually, a lot of the works in the As They Saw It exhibition are artists that are represented in the Thaw collection. So yeah, thank you for that. It's extraordinary. I feel like this conversation is sort of going in the direction of a question that I would love to pose to you, to all of you. And that is, across all of your various specialties, we have art historians and curators, a professor, and an art writer and critic. So can you discuss the role each of you play in fostering recognition and representation of women and minority artists through your disciplines?
I'll take that on first. Absolutely. I should also say that I have a very unique background in regards to art history. I have a master's in women's studies and a PhD in African American studies. So I came through art through a kind of different channel. But I do think that spending time having to like learn and research about Black women's lived experiences, history, culture has, I think, been integral to how I present information on not just Black artists, but Black women artists specifically. I think that, and I forgot was who mentioned this, either Jessica or Emily, but the reality of the situation is, right, is that I feel like when we're talking about how art history is created, there are essentially channels that one has to go through to be like, concretized in the canon. And for a very long time, African American artists were prevented from really being able to fully participate in that. And so I think not only is it important to highlight, these women's artworks, their stories, their experiences, their collaborations with other Black women artists, but also things that like present them as whole people, not to get super political here, but I don't think that it's a secret, right, that we live in a society that has been predicated on anti-Black racism since the inception of America. And so when you're thinking about like what it means to have to grapple with that reality, what it's also meant for African American women in particular to be able to survive that reality, a lot of times it has come with having to like compartmentalize parts of you, or unfortunately not show up fully as you out of fear of you being distorted through the perception of someone else. W.B. Du Bois calls that double consciousness, that sensation of viewing oneself through the eyes of like the society in which you live in. And so I think what I really try to do is to show these artists, like I said, as whole people, present them as whole people who not only are having these like artistic and political concerns, but who are mothers and sisters and daughters and wives and lovers and just people in the world. And so, yeah, I think that that is how for me, I kind of contribute to ongoing efforts of making spaces or creating spaces for Black women's experiences to be really seen fully.
Thank you. Emily or Jessica, did you want to also take that question?
Sure. Following Kiara is tough. So, so again, I think of my role as kind of twofold. There's my own writing practice, that often is in Boston Art Review, but in other places, and my role as an editor. And in my own writing practice, or just writing in general, I mean, I'm not going to belabor it because I've said it before, but yeah, if these things aren't documented and recorded, they don't live the same way. They don't, when someone wants to go, many years later and learn about that artist, if this stuff isn't there, they don't, the scholarship doesn't really happen. And there's a difference, not better, not worse, just a difference between writing for the public and writing for the art world, right? And so art writing and art criticism is hopefully making these shows and these artists live longer to the general public, right? Because I read lots of art historian scholarly papers, but I don't think the general public does. So there's that. And then as an editor, it's being thoughtful, again, about who we're inviting to contribute. Who are we asking to go review a show or to profile an artist or to interview an artist? And are we being sure that we are looking for diverse perspectives from that angle as well, because that is not to say that like people of color have to write about people of color and women have to write about women, or it doesn't have to be that, you know, narrow, but a person of color is going to come from a different cultural perspective, is going to have a different understanding of you know, a Black woman is going to have a different understanding of a show by a Black woman than I am. They just are, from their lived experience. And that doesn't mean that we have to like match everybody up really carefully, but it does mean that we have to know that we're making space for that level of discourse, and that we're privileging those sorts of stories as well. So that's something I think about a lot.
And Emily?
Sure. Yeah. So it's always so hard to follow both Kiara and Jessica together. And I feel so lucky to be here in a conversation with you both. So I guess I have a very brief two-part answer to that question. So in my own research, as an expert on American sculpture and women in sculpture, I almost exclusively work on artists about whom there's very little scholarship. And it's sort of a blessing and a curse. Like I tend to be most interested in artists who I feel need to be written about, or whose stories need to be told more widely. I almost like look for them, right? Like if I come across, you know, an artist who's referenced in a random like reference textbook, and then I Google them and I'm like, oh, their papers are at Archives of American Art, but like there's no articles. Like, the gears start turning, and that's usually my next project. So, and like for me, I want to fill gaps, you know, in the literature, and for me, this is my way of doing that. I really like digging through archives and having to think creatively in my research. Kiara, earlier when you were talking about your work with archives and some of the challenges of the material that you work with, and also just kind of like the excitement of like going to someone's like basement or attic and like, you know, really digging through these like important historical materials that are like, for whatever reason, you know, like not in a conventional like you know, university archive or museum library or what have you. So we could talk about that on some other thread maybe. But anyway, so that's my research. And then in my day-to-day work at National Gallery, you know, my most immediate role in fostering representation of women and underrepresented artists is through my work with acquisitions, which we've talked about a bit already. But, you know, our institution, like many others, has been bringing in a lot more contemporary art in the last couple of years. And so for me, you know, it's really special to be able to connect directly with artists, have conversations with them about their practice, build that relationship so that our team can ensure we're able to care for and steward their work in perpetuity. You know, I have a mentor at my museum who, you know, says like we wouldn't be here doing what we do if it weren't for artists. And that sticks with me, and I take that very seriously, you know, in my work, is stewarding the work the best that I can. And when I have that privilege to be able to speak with an artist directly, like, you know, making sure that that information, you know, lives on, and that we can care for these artworks in perpetuity.
So could each of you then discuss an artist in the As They Saw It exhibition that you feel deserves more recognition than they've had up to this point? Who'd like to go? Kiara?
Sure. I am going to go with Louisiana Bendoff, who is associated with the quilters of Gee's Bend, Alabama. I think it's worth looking into her story because she has a very interesting story. Just that of, you know, growing up on a farm, you know, not really able to attend school in the way that she wants to because she's having to help her family on the farm. How quilts had always been done by her grandmother. And just to kind of give some historical context, I mean, African American women have been engaging in quilt making since like the 19th century. And I would say even probably prior to that. But when we think about like the institution of slavery, that was definitely an art form, although they wouldn't have called it that then, that was undertaken by a lot of, Black women and continued after that because there is a utilitarian function to quilts, But learning how to quilt from her grandmother, and when she talks about how when her grandmother dies, and years later, when she begins quilting, how when she sees her quilts and her grandmother's quilts in the exhibition or in the G's Ben exhibition, really having this like moment of like, wow, my grandmother died, just an obscure woman, a mother who most people didn't know. And now because of this exhibition with G's Bend and that, bringing or showcasing rather, the cultures of that area that, her grandmother is now considered a renowned artist, And she also talks about how like, even for her, she started out just doing like little house top pattern quilts, and that's essentially like where you start with like a square and then the squares that are continuing building on the outside are alternating in color similar to how you see here, but essentially not feeling like a real artist until she starts creating these kind of prints that are shown in the show, but also like please look up G's Ben, Quilters of G's Ben, because it will blow your mind away. But I think for me and just my research in general and just my interest in general, I am fascinated by quotidian life, specifically quotidian Black life. I I love the mundane. I love the everyday, um, because for me and my experiences growing up, it was the everyday, ordinary women who were doing things in the community to ensure that people were taken care of. And so when I think about someone like Louisiana Bendoff, who never in her wildest dreams, would have even thought that quilt making would have taken her that far, let alone um, posit her as an artist worth taken seriously, um, it makes me reflect of just like how far we've come in some regard, around craft and what was termed women's work now being considered fine art, but also for this Black woman who was essentially you know coming from poverty and had inherited a gift, and not sure where that gift was going to take her, but continued to do it. I just think it's a very inspiring story. And I would encourage folks to look into her and the other quilters of G's Bend, because their work is beautiful. But not only that, it's like it builds, like I said, upon a tradition that had been erected by African American women, centuries. And so, yeah, I think for me, this is an artist who I think deserves more recognition. And I'm so glad that you all included her in this show.
Thank you. Emily?
Sure. So I had one answer, then I thought of something different. As Kiara was talking, it's sort of on that similar theme of like networks and community, which I know is a huge theme in this show, which I so appreciated. So I guess going back to also something that Jessica was bringing up, which was the role of historic Native American art, not just, in the As They Saw It exhibition, but also like at the Fenimore in general. So I was really excited to see a pot by Nampeo in the exhibition. And Nampeo, I think, is definitely an artist that is known in certain communities and circles. Like if you, have lived in the Southwest, or, you go, or like you're someone who frequents galleries devoted to Pueblo or Southwest pottery, you might know her name, but I feel like the vast majority do not, sadly. And so for those who don't know, Nampeo is a Hopi artist. She's from the Hopi Reservation, which is located in what's now Arizona. And she's a major matriarch in the story of Pueblo pottery. She's, oh gosh, dates. I want to say she's like early 20th century, but don't quote me on that. But her work draws from ancestral pottery fragments, and it became so meaningful and influential to generations of clay artists who are still inspired by her today. And I was reminded of her, as Kiara was talking about G's Bend, just kind of thinking about how like certain artistic traditions and techniques, get passed from, mother to daughter, or, from family member to family member in some of these circles and communities that are represented in the show. We see that in Nampeo's work because, she passes down to her descendants, and they pass them on to their descendants. And Pueblo pottery in general is a living tradition, in which this is what's done, is you pass this craft on to the next generation. And so Nampeo's work and legacy really encapsulates that. So anyway, definitely Google her if you're not familiar with Nampeo.
Yeah, and thank you, Emily, again, and Jessica, both for highlighting the Thaw collection of American Indian art. Excuse me, Thaw collection of American Indian art. I just want to point out we're talking about data, and at least 50% of the Thaw collection was made solely by women, and the other 50% women artists worked on. So out of the 218 items on view in Thaw, 75% at least were made fully or in part by women. So really strong representation of women in the Thaw collection of American Indian art, and something we're very proud of. So thank you, Emily. And then Jessica, did you want to also tackle that question?
Yeah, I went a different route in that I picked someone I had never heard of, but was completely enamored by. And I was like, well, I've never heard of her. Probably some more people have never heard of her. Some more people should know about her. Marianne Wilson, I'm obsessed. So one of America's first watercolorists. That's crazy to me. Lived publicly with her female partner in a same-sex relationship. Amazing. And made her own paints from berry juice, vegetable dyes, and brick dust. I mean, this woman is my hero. Not much is known about her. There was the mermaid piece that's on view was in 1815, but she was discovered in 1943 when a New York art gallery discovered a portfolio of her drawings. So, but her story, what little we know of it, is so special. After the death of her partner, she disappeared. She was so inconsolable that she disappeared. And now, so all I'm saying is like really ripe for scholarship. And I mean, look at that. That is so incredible. And I think the wall text pointed out that she's holding kind of more masculine, usually it's like a hairbrush and a mirror, right, with mermaids. Whereas this mermaid is, holding a spear. It's just, I think it's incredible, and I want people to write about her. So I'm just throwing that out there to the scholars in the room.
Yeah, it's actually another of the works in the Fenimore's collection. And I also love it. Okay, my goodness. Here's a broad question, and I'll put it to all. Oh, let me just actually also remind those of our viewers, if you have a question for our guests, please do post them in the chat, and I will be very happy to ask those questions. Okay, so I do have another broad question for each of you. And we honestly, maybe we've already tackled a lot of this, but we can revisit it a little bit. Just if you could speak broadly about the challenges women in art have faced, and feel free to go back as far as you like, or start in the 19th century and work your way to the present, whatever you feel moved to do. Maybe Emily first.
Sure. So I can just, I guess, give like a micro case study example. So I'm going to talk about sculpture specifically because that's primarily what I research and what I work on. But a big thing that affected women sculptors specifically, and oh shoot, I should probably back up a little bit. There are a lot, contrary to what one might think or what one might read in an art history textbook, there were a lot of women making academic sculpture in the 19th century, and especially around the turn of the century in the US. So throwing that out there, there were a lot of them, especially like there was a huge uptick in women entering the sculpture field, like around 1890s, 1900s, well into 1920s. So that's a phenomenon. But there are several, around the Civil War period, many women who were flocking to Rome specifically because they could live more freely, have better access to resources like certain types of stone, and also the assistants and the laborers to be able to help with that process. So the thing to know about sculpture, in a nutshell, I'll be very brief. Especially in like academic sculpture in the 19th century, it wasn't just one individual person carving a marble statue. It was an individual. So if we're talking about like Harriet Hosmer, for example, who's a big name around the period that I'm talking about, it wasn't just her, carving, a single thing from rock. She would make a model out of clay, and then that clay would then be used to create a plaster model, and then all of these different devices and tools would be used to create a larger model, and then eventually you end up with a team of carvers who use these very like technical devices, like what's called a pointing machine, for example. Not enough time to explain what that is today. Google it if you're curious. It's a really interesting device to then create the final marble work to the exact precise measurements of the original model that the master artist created. Now, this matters when we're talking about women because someone like Harriet Hosmer specifically, some unfortunately misinformed writer, I think in London, like mid-19th century, start saying, oh, well, Harriet Hosmer's pieces are good, but, she didn't really make them. She relied on, these male assistants. She didn't really, she's not a real artist. I'm paraphrasing here, but so this goes out there into the world. And then, Harriet Hosmer feels the need to sort of speak up and educate the world about how sculpture actually works. And so she writes all these essays sort of in response to that then, start circulating out there in defense of her work. This was common practice, that one critic just didn't know, that didn't have that knowledge. But I don't think, and many scholars would agree that like, it's not a coincidence that the famous, woman sculptor who also, fun fact, Harriet Hosmer, dressed in pants and like had what we now can recognize as like same-sex relationships, and she lived in a very progressive lifestyle abroad. She was not written about in the same way as her male peers, and something that was expected of her male counterparts. She was then chastised for not, quote unquote, not making her own sculpture. So, and then this has like a chain reaction on, you know, women making sculpture for decades to come. So anyway, I said that was a brief little micro case study, but I may have gone a little over. But anyway, that's sort of the earlier end of the spectrum in history, I guess. I'll pass it off to Jessica or Kiara to get us a little later in time, maybe.
Well, I mean, we could everything, all the things. They let you into schools, but they don't let you into like the drawing classes. You can't actually access the models. Then you can't like leave the schools to actually go on chaperone to like see the stuff, to do the things. It's like, it's crazy. And then, you know, they take, you know, you get taken advantage of sexually. You get, right. I mean, it's just crazy. But I'm going to focus on children because children is huge. I mean, if you, I mean, it's still a problem, right? I mean, it's still a thing. My friends who are artists and have children are like, I would love to do a residency. How do you do that? Whether, I mean, you either didn't have them and then there was all sorts of problems that arose from choosing not to have children, or you were wealthy enough to have childcare. So very stratified, rare group of people. There may have been someone with a supportive husband. I don't know, possible that one existed, and took care of the kids. But for the most part, you either relied on community, which Kiara could probably talk about better than me, or you gave them up. And there's so many really tragic stories of women artists who did not get lost access to their children because they wanted to work. There's the writer keeps speaking in quotes, but something that has really always broken my heart and is really uncomfortable to hear, but I think important, is this quote by Alice Neal, who after losing her first child, her second child was taken away from her when she was 18 months old, to be raised by her husband's family in Cuba because she was considered an unfit mother. And when she was interviewed about it, she said, I've always had this awful dichotomy. I loved Isabetta, I'm sorry, it was her daughter. I loved Isabetta, of course I did, but I wanted to paint. And to like our modern sensibilities, or any sensibilities really, that's kind of horrifying, right? But you know, and then you have to ask yourself, well, what is it more horrifying that she was placed in that position that we don't place men in ever, right? That she had to choose. And women are still choosing all the time between their children and their practice. I can go on about that for a while, but I'm gonna end scene.
I'll jump on that actually, because I think that was something that has also come up for me in my research when I talked to Black women artists of the 70s. Childcare was a real thing, you know, unlike you said, Jessica, even now, like when I hear people say, well, she has a kid, is she going to be able? And it's like, okay, but he does too. So are we not having these same comments, you know? But I also think what's interesting too is how that conundrum also kind of bred a kind of ingenuity that at times also informed the practices of some of these women artists. And so, like I said, even taking it back to like where we at, as a collective, creating a network of babysitting. So that means that when 4 or 5 of us are in the studio, one person can watch everyone's kids, you know? I think about some of their programs, which honestly, I would argue, helped inform our language around social practice art now. But they had programs like, you know, art workshops at homeless shelters. And in addition to like teaching these various art techniques, also teaching women how to survive in homeless shelters, how to make their own organic baby food, going to prisons, and teaching women how to create art so that they can raise money for their families and send it back, you know? And so as tragic as this like position is, and again, women artists are still grappling with it, I'm also equally as amazed as the either the networks or the modalities they created to ensure that they were able to produce their art. And I mean, I think this is implied, but just misogyny, women artists going to shows and galleries being apprehensive because if you have kids, are you actually going to come and do the work? Are you actually going to have things done by the deadline? I think about the Spiral Art Collective that was instrumental during the 1960s in the civil rights movement and was comprised of the masters, Romare Bearden, Charles Alston, Norman Lewis, some of these folks and the one woman, Emma Amos. And I remember when I do too, she's great. But I remember when I was writing my chapter of my dissertation on Betty Bladen Taylor, and I was talking to her brother, and her brother was telling me that essentially the reason why Emma Amos was even included is because they needed someone young and someone who could go get them coffee. Which is crazy to think about. But also other Black women artists on her behalf being like, listen, we're not going to do that. Are calling out these misogynists, calling out this acts of misogyny. So that's the other thing. And I think that this is something that is probably a thread amongst what we all do. Women were resisting these conditions, in a myriad of different ways. And so, yeah, I think though motherhood very much so an impediment alongside, racism, alongside sexism, conditions that, I think women artists are still grappling with today, albeit in a different way, but still grappling with for sure.
Yeah, it's just, I'm so excited by this entire conversation, but I think that's the point. I know we talked about this together offline, so that's the point that I think if I leave a point, that's the point I want to make is I should speak for myself. I don't want to be invited in to do it your way, your being the kind of current patriarchal white supremacist way of doing things. We don't want to be invited in to do things your way. We want everyone else to start learning from what women artists and artists of color have been doing for a long time in terms of building community and building equity. And actually, we don't want to be away from our kids. That's not the answer. It's not take our kids so we can make art, right? We don't want to see our kids anymore. It's figure out a better way of doing it. Soapbox.
Yeah.
Can I also just say really quick, Danielle, that I think even this conversation that we're having is in some ways an embodiment of what we're hoping to see, in terms of a trend going forward, 3 women from various vantage points with different expertise coming from very different points of view and being able to learn a lot from one another by way of the richness of our research, but also our experiences, because I think you had mentioned earlier, Jessica, your life experiences do inform how you approach everything, art included, and the more diverse voices that we can have at the table, the better I think we can understand not only various artworks and the context behind that, but just again, to be able to imagine a future that's not in existence, but we know it's tangible given where we are now. So I think this was a brilliant start. I mean, and obviously there are lots of institutions and organizations further in this work, but I think moving forward, I would just I would love for this to be the standard, I would just say.
Yeah, and that actually was right along the lines of the last question I was going to pose to the 3 of you, which is what needs to happen or change for equal recognition and representation. And you kind of said it just there, Kiara, but would you or Jessica or Emily like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose just echoing Kiara, I mean, just I'm so grateful to be in this space, and I do feel like this is a um, great example of the conversations and the collaboration that really needs to happen. I feel like um, it can't be just one person or one curator or one scholar advancing this work. None of it happens in a vacuum. You have to be one, responding to the needs of your audience and your readership and your community, but you also I mean I for me, like, I'm the product of those I've worked with, and those who have helped lift me up um to get to where I am, as a scholar and as a curator. So everything is about collaboration, relationships, and I think that's the strength of this work and how we'll move things forward. So
Amen.
Okay, all right. Emily, Kiara, Jessica, this has been so fascinating and informative. Thank you so much for participating in this discussion and for sharing your insight and expertise. It means so much to hear different perspectives, and we're deeply grateful to you for your time and for being a part of the As They Saw It programming. Thank you again to the Art Bridges Foundation for its support of educational programs associated with the As They Saw It exhibition. I'd also like to give a special shout out to Fenimore Art Museum's Manager of Arts Education, Kevin Gray. Kevin has been behind the scenes on this program, but it couldn't have happened without him. So thank you, Kevin. And to our audience, Fenimore Art Museum is so proud to have presented the Fight for Recognition, a series of discussions. We also have a host of other programs to complement the exhibition As They Saw It, Women Artists Then and Now, including art making workshops, process art workshops, and Celebrate Native America, a multidisciplinary festival featuring extraordinary women artists. To learn about these programs and so much more, please visit our website, fenimoreartmuseum.org. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We hope to see you at Fenimore Art Museum soon.